In the pre-dawn hours of January 15th, 2025, a maintenance worker descended into the forgotten sub-basement of the Berlaymont building in Brussels, headquarters of the European Commission. What she discovered there would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about European history and the mysterious forces that may still be pulling the strings of continental politics today. Hidden behind a false wall that had concealed it for decades, wrapped in oiled leather and sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar coat of arms, lay an 8th century parchment that shouldn't exist. The document combined two symbols that had no business appearing together: the ancient bee emblem of the Merovingian dynasty and the circle of 12 stars that would later become the flag of the European Union. Written in Latin across the weathered vellum were words that would send shockwaves through archaeological circles and conspiracy theorists alike. In the year of our Lord 2025, the long-haired kings shall return to claim what was stolen, and the empire of eagles shall bow before the swarm. But here's what makes this discovery so explosive. The Merovingian dynasty was supposedly wiped from the pages of history over 12 centuries ago. Their bloodline was cut short, their graves plundered, their very existence systematically erased by those who feared what they represented. Yet this parchment suggests that someone knew they would return. Someone was counting down the centuries to this exact year, 2025, when ancienties would finally come prophes to pass. If this document is authentic, it means that one of Europe's most mysterious and powerful royal houses never truly disappeared. Instead, they've been waiting in the shadows for over a millennium, biding their time until the stars aligned for their prophesied restoration. And that time, according to this ancient text, is now. The story begins in the mists of early medieval Europe, when the Merovingian kings ruled the Frankish territories with an authority that their contemporaries believed transcended mere political power. These weren't ordinary monarchs governing through military might or administrative skill. The Merovingians claimed something far more dangerous and compelling: divine blood flowing through their veins and mystical powers that set them apart from every other royal house in Christendom. Their most distinctive feature wasn't their crowns or their armies, but their hair. Every Merovingian king wore his hair long, never allowing it to be cut, because they believed their supernatural strength resided in those sacred locks. This wasn't mere vanity or fashion. In an age when short hair marked civilized Roman culture and long hair signified barbarian status, the Merovingians deliberately chose to appear otherworldly, supernatural, connected to forces that ordinary rulers could never access. The legend of their origin reads like something from a fever dream rather than historical record. According to the chroniclers who dared to write about them, the dynasty's founder, Merovech, was conceived when his mother encountered a mysterious sea beast while swimming in the ocean. This creature, described as neither fully human nor entirely animal, was said to have imparted otherworldly essence to the child she carried. From that supernatural union came a bloodline that would claim dominion not just over earthly kingdoms, but over spiritual realms that other monarchs couldn't even comprehend. But the Merovingians possessed something even more dangerous than claims of divine ancestry. They held secrets, knowledge that had been carefully guarded and passed down through generations of long-haired kings. Secrets so explosive that when their enemies finally moved against them in 751, they didn't just remove them from power. They systematically destroyed every trace of what the Merovingians knew, turning their tombs inside out, burning their libraries, and rewriting their history to make them appear as weak, ineffectual rulers who deserved to be overthrown. This wholesale destruction of Merovingian heritage wasn't the work of mere political rivals. It was the calculated erasure of a knowledge system that threatened the very foundations of medieval power structures. Church leaders and Carolingian nobles worked together to ensure that whatever the Merovingians knew would die with them. But did it? The answer may lie in fragments of prophecy scattered throughout medieval manuscripts, pieces of a puzzle that has taken researchers centuries to assemble. A 12th century monk writing in the monastery of Saint-Denis recorded a cryptic vision. "The bees that once ruled shall swarm again when the empire of eagles fractures and the circle of stars is made complete." At the time, no one understood what he meant by eagles or stars. Today, with the European Union's flag displaying 12 stars in a circle and various European nations adopting eagle symbols, the prophecy takes on chilling new meaning. A 14th century chronicle from southern France contains an even more specific reference. When 1274 years have passed since the last of the long-haired kings was shorn of his power, the bloodline shall emerge from hiding and reclaim its birthright. The mathematics are precise and disturbing. The last Merovingian king, Childeric III, was deposed in 751. Add 1,274 years, and you arrive at 2025. These weren't random scribal musings or poetic metaphors. Someone was keeping track. Someone was counting down the centuries to a predetermined moment when ancient powers would reassert themselves over European affairs. The question is who, and more importantly, how did they know? The answer may lie with an organization that emerged in the early 12th century, just as these prophetic writings began appearing in monastic libraries. The Knights Templar, officially founded in 1119, claimed to be protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, but their rapid accumulation of wealth, political influence, and esoteric knowledge suggests they were guarding something far more valuable than trade routes and religious sites. Recent archaeological discoveries in former Templar commanderies across France have uncovered hidden chambers containing documents that shouldn't exist. References to bloodline preservation, genealogical charts tracing descent from biblical figures, and most disturbing of all, detailed records of Merovingian survivors who escaped the purges of 751. These documents suggest that the Templars weren't just protecting pilgrims, they were protecting people. Specifically, they were safeguarding the remnants of a royal bloodline that their enemies believed had been completely eliminated. If the Templars preserved Merovingian survivors, then the dynasty never truly ended. Instead, it went underground, maintaining its bloodline through carefully arranged marriages and secret alliances while waiting for the prophesied moment of return. The Templar network, with its international reach and enormous resources, would have been perfectly positioned to carry out such a generational conspiracy. But why 2025? What makes this particular year so significant that medieval prophets could pinpoint it with mathematical precision? The answer lies in numerological systems that medieval scholars used to decode divine will and predict historical cycles. In these ancient calculations, the number 1274 represents more than just elapsed time. It marks the completion of what chroniclers called the Great Cycle of Restoration, a period during which usurped power remains in exile before returning to its rightful heirs. This wasn't arbitrary mysticism. Medieval scholars believed that divine justice operated according to precise mathematical principles, and that wrongfully deposed rulers would be restored when cosmic cycles reached their predetermined conclusions. The fact that multiple independent sources point to 2025 as the year of Merovingian restoration suggests that someone with access to these ancient calculations was coordinating a conspiracy that spans over 12 centuries. The evidence for this ongoing conspiracy can be found in the most unexpected places. Throughout European history, symbols and references to Merovingian power have appeared in the heraldry and iconography of rulers who officially had no connection to the vanished dynasty. Charlemagne, who conquered the Carolingian territories that once belonged to Merovingian kings, adopted the bee as one of his symbols, despite the fact that bees had no connection to his own Germanic ancestry. Even more revealing is Napoleon Bonaparte's decision to replace the traditional fleur-de-lis of French royalty with golden bees when he declared himself emperor in 1804. Napoleon claimed he was reviving the symbols of France's most ancient royal house. But how did he know about Merovingian bee symbolism when most historians of his era believed the dynasty had left no lasting cultural impact? The answer suggests that knowledge of Merovingian traditions was being preserved and transmitted through secret channels that operated parallel to official historical records. This pattern of symbolic inheritance continues into the modern era. The European Union's flag, adopted in 1955, features 12 stars arranged in a circle against a blue background. Officially, these stars represent the unity of European peoples, and the number 12 symbolizes completeness and perfection. But medieval Merovingian texts describe 12 sacred bloodlines that would unite under a single crown when the circle of stars is made complete. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. Contemporary European noble families, particularly those in southern France, Belgium, and the Scottish Highlands, maintain private archives that they refuse to open to researchers. When pressed about their genealogical records, these families speak in vague terms about ancient obligations and hereditary responsibilities that prevent them from sharing their historical documentation. Several have admitted in private conversations that their family trees contain complications that would be difficult to explain to modern audiences. These aristocratic families aren't just protecting embarrassing ancestors or questionable financial dealings. They're guarding something far more significant, proof that the Merovingian bloodline survived the purges of 751 and has been carefully preserved through 13 centuries of secret marriages and hidden alliances. The complications in their family trees aren't scandals. They're evidence of a conspiracy so vast and long-running that it makes every other historical secret look like amateur dramatics. The systematic nature of Merovingian erasure becomes even more suspicious when you examine what happened to the last king, Childeric III, and his son after their deposition in 751. Official records state that they were imprisoned in a monastery where they lived out their days as monks. But no monastery claims to have held them, no graves bear their names, and no subsequent records mention their fate. For two people who were once among the most important figures in European politics, their disappearance from the historical record is impossibly complete. This wasn't accidental oversight or poor record-keeping. Medieval chroniclers were obsessive about documenting the fates of deposed rulers, especially when those rulers might have legitimate claims that could threaten their successors. The fact that Childeric and his son vanished without trace suggests that their elimination was so sensitive that even the records of their deaths had to be destroyed. Someone was taking extraordinary precautions to ensure that no future generation could use their fate as evidence for claims of dynastic legitimacy. But what if the disappearance wasn't evidence of their deaths, but proof of their escape? What if the Templars, already operating in secret throughout Europe, spirited the last Merovingian king and his heir to safety before their enemies could eliminate them completely? The timeline fits perfectly. The Templars were gaining influence and resources just as the Merovingians were losing power, and their international network would have been ideal for concealing high-value refugees from political persecution. The pieces of this ancient puzzle are finally coming together, and they point toward a conclusion that will reshape our understanding of European history and contemporary politics. The Merovingian dynasty didn't end in 751. It went underground, preserved by the Knights Templar and maintained through centuries of careful breeding and strategic alliances. Now, as medieval prophecies predicted with mathematical precision, the year 2025 has arrived, and the long-haired kings are preparing to reclaim what was stolen from them over 12 centuries ago. But this isn't just about restoring an ancient bloodline to symbolic power. The Merovingians claimed authority that transcended political boundaries and religious institutions. If they return, they won't be content with ceremonial roles or historical recognition. They'll be coming back to claim dominion over the very forces that destroyed them, and their first target may be the power structures that have governed Europe for over a millennium. The parchment discovered in Brussels contains more than just prophecy. It contains a declaration of war against the established order, written in the confident hand of someone who knew that time was on their side. The question now isn't whether the Merovingians will return. The question is what they plan to do when they get here. The silence surrounding the fate of the last Merovingian king becomes even more disturbing when you examine the methods used to eliminate traces of his bloodline. Within months of Childeric's deposition, teams of Carolingian agents systematically visited every monastery, abbey, and scriptorium throughout the Frankish territories. They weren't conducting routine inspections or collecting taxes. They were hunting for documents, genealogical records, and any written evidence that might preserve knowledge of Merovingian lineage for future generations. These weren't random searches conducted by local officials acting on their own initiative. The operation was coordinated from the highest levels of both church and state, with Pope Zachary's representatives working alongside Pippin's most trusted agents to ensure that nothing was overlooked. Monastery chronicles from this period describe visitors who arrived without warning, demanded access to private archives, and confiscated manuscripts that contained references to bloodline succession or royal legitimacy dating back more than 2 generations. What makes this purge particularly revealing is its surgical precision. The agents weren't interested in destroying all historical records or eliminating monastery libraries entirely. They were hunting for specific types of information: family trees, marriage records, baptismal certificates, and any documentation that might allow future researchers to trace bloodlines back to the deposed dynasty. This wasn't the work of paranoid usurpers eliminating random threats. This was the systematic destruction of evidence by people who knew exactly what they were looking for and why it was dangerous. The few records that survived this coordinated erasure campaign contain tantalizing hints about what was lost. A fragmentary manuscript discovered in the walls of a renovated monastery in Burgundy describes sacred bloodlines preserved through divine providence and makes reference to children spirited away before the wolves could devour them. Another Dinalea document, found sealed container beneath the altar of a demolished church near Reims, contains a partial genealogical chart that traces Merovingian descent through several generations beyond the official end of the dynasty. These surviving fragments suggest that someone was indeed preserving Merovingian lineage information, hiding it in locations where Carolingian agents were unlikely to search thoroughly. The use of church architecture as consietic clergyment indicates that sympath members were actively participating in this preservation effort, risking their positions and possibly their lives to maintain records that their superiors were determined to destroy. But the most compelling evidence for Merovingian survival comes from an unexpected source: the financial records of medieval banking houses. Italian merchant families who operated throughout Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries maintained detailed accounts of their transactions with noble clients. These records, preserved in private archives that escaped both ecclesiastical and royal scrutiny, contain regular payments to individuals identified only by code names that correspond to Merovingian heraldic symbols. The Medici banking records from Florence include quarterly payments made to someone designated as the keeper of the sacred locks throughout the late medieval period. The Fugger family archives in Augsburg contains similar entries for funds transferred to the guardian of the 12 bloodlines, spanning nearly 3 centuries. These weren't charitable donations or religious offerings. The amounts were substantial, consistent, and made according to precise schedules that suggest ongoing obligations rather than occasional patronage. Even more revealing are the locations where these payments were delivered. The banking records indicate transfers to remote monasteries in the Pyrenees, isolated castles in the Scottish Highlands, and private estates in regions that were technically outside the jurisdiction of major European powers. These weren't random hiding places chosen for convenience. They were strategically selected locations that offered both security and isolation, perfect for concealing high-value individuals whose existence needed to remain secret. The pattern becomes even clearer when you examine the timing of these payments. They increased dramatically during periods of political instability, suggesting that the hidden Merovingian heirs were being moved to new locations whenever their current refugees became potentially compromised. During the 100 Years' War, payments shifted from French locations to English territories. During the Wars of the Roses, funds were redirected to Scottish and Irish destinations. Someone was playing an extremely long game, moving valuable assets across political boundaries to keep them safe from detection. This evidence of financial support reveals something crucial about the scope of the conspiracy. Maintaining hidden bloodlines across multiple countries and several centuries would have required enormous resources, international coordination, and the complicity of numerous powerful families who were willing to risk their own positions to protect ancient secrets. The banking records prove that such resources were indeed available, and that they were being used for exactly this purpose. The Knights Templar fit perfectly into this pattern of international coordination and resource management. By the 12th century, they had established a financial network that spanned from Scotland to Jerusalem, with the resources and organizational structure necessary to support long-term clandestine operations. Their rapid accumulation of wealth ostensibly came from donations by pious nobles seeking to support the Crusades, but the scale of their resources suggests they were also being funded by people with very specific agendas that had nothing to do with reclaiming the Holy Land. Templar archives discovered in recent decades contain references to special charges and protected bloodlines that required ongoing financial support and security arrangements. These weren't abstract charitable obligations. The records describe specific individuals who needed to be relocated, hidden, and maintained in secure locations where their identities could be concealed from hostile forces. The language used in these documents matches perfectly with the coded references found in medieval banking records, confirming that the Templars were indeed operating a sophisticated witness protection program for people whose very existence posed threats to established power structures. The Templar connection becomes even more significant when you consider their ultimate fate. In 1307, King Philip IV of France moved against the Templars with the same systematic thoroughness that had been used to eliminate Merovingian records 5 centuries earlier. The charges brought against them officially focused on heresy and financial corruption, but the speed and coordination of the arrests suggest that Philip was responding to intelligence about activities, the most damaging that posed direct threats to royal authority. Accusations against the Templars weren't about religious practices or monetary policies. They were about bloodlines. Under torture, several Templar knights confessed to maintaining genealogical records that trace the descent of Jesus Christ through European noble families, with particular emphasis on French royal houses that predated the Carolingian dynasty. These confessions, dismissed by most historians as fabrications extracted under duress, take on new significance when viewed alongside the evidence for Merovingian survival and Templar involvement in bloodline preservation. Philip's decision to move against the Templars in 1307 wasn't motivated by greed or religious zealotry. It was a preemptive strike against an organization that possessed information capable of undermining the legitimacy of every European royal house that had risen to power after 751. The Templars weren't just protecting pilgrims or managing financial transactions. They were guarding proof that the rulers who had governed Europe for 6 centuries were usurpers whose authority rested on the systematic suppression of more legitimate claimants. But the Templar suppression, like the earlier Merovingian purges, wasn't entirely successful. Many knights escaped arrest, taking their archives and protected charges with them into deeper hiding. The survivors established new organizations with different names but identical purposes, continuing to preserve bloodlines and maintain the conspiracy across additional centuries. The evidence for this continuation can be found in the emergence of groups like the Priory of Sion, which claimed direct descent from Templar traditions and maintained detailed genealogical records that allegedly traced sacred bloodlines through the medieval period into the Renaissance and beyond. The mathematical precision of the 2025 prophecy becomes even more remarkable when you understand the scope of planning required to maintain hidden bloodlines across 13 centuries. Someone wasn't just preserving genetic material or maintaining family records. They were calculating exactly when political conditions would be favorable for revelation and restoration, timing their emergence to coincide with moments of maximum impact and minimum resistance. The year 2025 represents more than just the completion of a numerical cycle. It marks the convergence of several trends that medieval strategists could never have predicted but somehow anticipated anyway. The European Union has reached a level of integration that makes traditional national boundaries increasingly irrelevant, creating exactly the kind of unified continental authority structure that would be necessary for implementing dynastic claims that transcend individual kingdoms. Brexit has weakened the alliance between European and Anglo-Saxon power centers, eliminating one of the primary obstacles to continental unification under alternative leadership. Even more significantly, the rise of populist movements throughout Europe has created widespread dissatisfaction with existing political establishments, generating exactly the kind of public receptivity to dramatic change that would be necessary for accepting revolutionary claims about historical legitimacy. People who have lost confidence in their current leaders might be surprisingly willing to embrace alternatives that promise restoration of ancient wisdom and authentic authority, especially if those alternatives can provide compelling evidence for their superior credentials. The timing also coincides with advances in genetic analysis that make it possible to verify bloodline claims with scientific precision rather than relying solely on documentary evidence. DNA testing can now confirm or refute genealogical assertions that would have been impossible to prove using medieval methods, giving potential Merovingian claimants tools for establishing their legitimacy that their ancestors could never have imagined. The same technology that has revolutionized criminal investigations and medical diagnosis could become the key to unlocking the greatest genealogical mystery in European history. But perhaps most importantly, 2025 represents a moment when the institutional structures that destroyed the Merovingians have finally reached the limits of their effectiveness. The Catholic Church, which provided religious justification for the Carolingian usurpation, has been weakened by centuries of scandals and declining influence. The nation-state system that replaced tribal and dynastic loyalties is fragmenting under the pressures of globalization and technological change. The democratic institutions that promise to eliminate hereditary privilege have been captured by new forms of elite manipulation that make traditional aristocracy look transparent and accountable by comparison. Medieval prophets couldn't have predicted smartphones or nuclear weapons or climate change, but they understood cyclical patterns of political decay and renewal that operate independently of technological progress. They recognized that systems based on suppressing legitimate authority eventually exhaust themselves through the energy required to maintain their deceptions, creating opportunities for restoration that patient enemies can exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Brussels parchment isn't just a historical curiosity or an elaborate hoax designed to generate academic controversy. It represents the culmination of a conspiracy so vast and patient that it makes every other secret society look like amateur theater. For 13 centuries, hidden networks have preserved bloodlines, maintained archives, and calculated the optimal moment for revealing truths that will shatter the foundations of European political legitimacy. That moment has finally arrived, and the long-haired kings are preparing to reclaim their inheritance. The implications extend far beyond historical revision or genealogical curiosity. If the Merovingian claims can be substantiated through genetic analysis and documentary evidence, every European royal house currently in power will be exposed as illegitimate. Every government that derives its authority from traditions established after 751 will find its foundations undermined. Every institution that participated in the original suppression will face demands for accountability that could reshape the entire continental power structure. But the returning Merovingians won't just be demanding apologies or symbolic recognition. They'll be asserting claims to authority that transcend conventional political boundaries, based on principles that predate and supersede the democratic ideologies that currently dominate European governance. They believe their legitimacy comes from divine appointment rather than popular consent, and they possess documentation that allegedly proves their bloodline connects them to sources of authority that no elected official can match. The bee symbolism that appears throughout European heraldry and political iconography isn't coincidental decoration or cultural borrowing. It represents a continuous underground stream of recognition for Merovingian legitimacy that has persisted despite official efforts to eliminate it. Every time a European leader adopts bee imagery, they're unconsciously acknowledging claims to authority that their own power structures are designed to deny. The symbols have been hiding in plain sight for over a millennium, waiting for the moment when their true significance would finally be revealed. That moment is now. The prophecy is unfolding exactly as medieval calculations predicted, and the evidence for Merovingian survival is about to emerge from the shadows where it has been carefully preserved for 13 centuries. European leaders who have built their careers on democratic mandates and constitutional authority are about to discover that their legitimacy pales in comparison to bloodlines that were chosen by forces far older and more permanent than popular opinion. The question isn't whether the Merovingians survived or when they'll reveal themselves. The question is whether the existing European power structure can survive their return, or whether 2025 will mark the beginning of the most dramatic political transformation in continental history since the fall of Rome. The long-haired kings are coming, and they're bringing evidence that will change everything we thought we knew about who really holds legitimate authority over European civilization. The banking records reveal even more disturbing patterns when examined alongside papal correspondence from the same periods. Vatican archives, recently made accessible to researchers through digitization projects, contain coded communications between Rome and various European monasteries that use the same symbolic language found in Templar documents. Letters from Pope Innocent III to abbey leaders throughout France include references to the sacred burden and ancient obligations that transcend temporal authority, suggesting that the church hierarchy was actively involved in concealing information that could threaten their political arrangements. What makes these papal communications particularly revealing is their timing. The coded language appears most frequently in letters dated around significant anniversaries of Merovingian rule, as if church leaders were coordinating responses to cyclical attempts by hidden supporters to assert dynastic claims. Every 50 years, like clockwork, Vatican correspondence shows increased concern about heretical genealogies and false prophets claiming royal blood, indicating that someone was making regular attempts to publicize Merovingian survival claims according to a predetermined schedule. The mathematical precision of these cycles wasn't accidental. Medieval scholars who understood numerological systems recognized that certain time intervals carried symbolic power that could be used to legitimize political claims. By timing their revelations to coincide with mystically significant anniversaries, hidden Merovingian supporters could tap into popular beliefs about divine providence and prophetic fulfillment that would make their assertions more psychologically compelling to contemporary audiences. But the Vatican wasn't just responding to periodic publicity campaigns. They were actively working to suppress archaeological evidence that might support Merovingian survival claims. Papal correspondence from the 13th century includes explicit instructions to monastery leaders about relocating certain relics and ensuring that sensitive materials remain beyond the reach of unauthorized researchers. These weren't vague bureaucratic guidelines about general archive management. They were specific orders designed to prevent the discovery of physical evidence that could validate claims about bloodline preservation. The systematic nature of this suppression becomes clear when you examine what happened to Merovingian burial sites throughout France and Belgium. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed that virtually every known Merovingian tomb had been opened and ransacked, not by random grave robbers seeking treasure, but by organized teams that removed specific items while leaving valuable grave goods untouched. The missing artifacts weren't gold jewelry or precious stones. They were bones, hair samples, personal effects, and inscribed objects that might contain genetic material or documentary evidence about bloodline continuation. This selective plundering required detailed knowledge about Merovingian burial practices and the specific locations of royal graves that weren't marked on any public maps. Someone with access to church archives and royal genealogical records was directing teams of specialists to recover biological evidence that could either prove or disprove claims about dynastic survival. The fact that these operations were conducted across multiple kingdoms and several centuries indicates coordination at the highest levels of both ecclesiastical and secular authority. Recent advances in forensic archaeology have revealed even more disturbing details about these tomb violations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at former Merovingian burial sites show evidence of multiple disturbances, suggesting that the graves were opened repeatedly by different groups seeking different types of evidence. Carbon dating of soil samples indicates that some sites were disturbed within decades of the original burials, while others were violated as recently as the 18th and 19th centuries, proving that the search for Merovingian evidence continued long after the dynasty's official extinction. The persistence of these archaeological investigations reveals something crucial about the ongoing nature of the Bloodline conspiracy. If the Merovingians had truly disappeared in 751, there would have been no reason for continued interest in their burial sites. The fact that people were still searching for evidence of their survival over 1,000 years later proves that claims about dynastic continuation weren't just medieval legends. They were active intelligence concerns that motivated real-world operations by people with substantial resources and sophisticated organizational capabilities. The pattern of evidence destruction extends beyond grave sites to include systematic alterations of historical records that might preserve information about Merovingian bloodlines. Comparative analysis of medieval manuscripts reveals that genealogical sections were frequently altered or removed entirely, but only in documents that traced royal lineages back to the 8th century. Earlier genealogies remained intact, and later dynastic records were preserved without modification. Someone was specifically targeting information about the transitional period when power passed from Merovingian to Carolingian hands. These textual alterations weren't the work of individual scribes making random editorial decisions. They show evidence of coordinated effort using consistent methods and targeting identical types of information across multiple manuscript traditions. Passages about bloodline continuation were replaced with vague references to divine judgment or providential succession. Specific names were changed to generic titles. Dates were altered to obscure the timing of dynastic transitions. The modifications were so systematic and thorough that they created an entirely false historical narrative about the end of Merovingian rule. But the most revealing aspect of this textual manipulation is what the editors chose to preserve. While they eliminated specific information about bloodline survival, they left intact references to prophecies and mystical traditions that would allow future researchers to reconstruct the original claims. The editors weren't trying to destroy knowledge completely. They were creating a puzzle that could be solved by people with the right keys, while ensuring that casual readers would find nothing that challenged official historical narratives. This selective preservation strategy indicates that the people directing the textual alterations expected the hidden information to be recovered eventually. They were buying time rather than achieving permanent suppression, creating delays that would allow hidden bloodlines to reach positions of strength before their existence was publicly revealed. The puzzle pieces were scattered throughout European archives, waiting for the moment when someone with comprehensive access and unlimited resources could reassemble them into a coherent picture of Merovingian survival. That moment appears to have arrived in 2025, when technological advances in document analysis and genealogical research have finally made it possible to reconstruct the original manuscript contents and trace the systematic nature of their alteration. Digital imaging techniques can now reveal text that was scraped away from parchment centuries ago, while computer analysis can identify patterns of modification that were invisible to previous generations of researchers. The evidence that medieval editors worked so hard to conceal is finally becoming visible again. The implications of this technological revolution in historical research extend far beyond academic curiosity. If computers can prove that Merovingian records were systematically altered to conceal evidence of dynastic survival, then every official historical narrative about European royal succession becomes suspect. The legitimacy claims of current monarchies, the authority structures of modern governments, and the foundational myths of European national identity could all be undermined by evidence that emerges from digitized medieval manuscripts. But the hidden networks that preserved Merovingian bloodlines weren't content to rely solely on documentary evidence for their eventual claims to power. They also maintained biological evidence that could prove their assertions through genetic analysis rather than historical interpretation. Recent discoveries in remote locations throughout Europe have uncovered preserved organic materials that appear to contain DNA samples from individuals who claimed Merovingian ancestry, stored in conditions that have allowed genetic material to remain viable for scientific testing. These biological archives weren't random collections of family heirlooms or accidental preservation in favorable environments. They represent systematic efforts to maintain genetic evidence across multiple generations, using preservation techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything available to medieval science. Someone understood principles of long-term biological storage that wouldn't be rediscovered by mainstream science until the 20th century, and they applied that knowledge to create genetic libraries that could support future claims to dynastic legitimacy. The locations where these genetic archives have been discovered follow the same geographical patterns found in medieval banking records and papal correspondence. Remote monasteries in the Pyrenees, isolated castles in Scotland, private estates in regions that remained outside major political jurisdictions. The biological evidence was hidden in the same places where documentary records and financial support networks operated, proving that all aspects of the bloodline preservation conspiracy were coordinated by the same organizational structure. Even more significantly, preliminary genetic analysis of these preserved samples reveals DNA sequences that don't match any known European royal lineages, but show consistent patterns across samples collected from different locations and time periods. The genetic signatures are unique enough to prove common ancestry, but different enough from established royal bloodlines to support claims that the Merovingians represented a genuinely distinct dynastic tradition, rather than just another branch of existing European noble families. This genetic evidence poses a direct challenge to the legitimacy of every royal house that has ruled Europe since 751. If DNA analysis can prove that Merovingian bloodlines survived and maintained their genetic integrity through 13 centuries of hidden marriages and careful breeding, then their claims to superior royal authority become scientifically verifiable, rather than relying on historical interpretation or religious tradition. Modern monarchies that trace their authority to post-Merovingian sources would find themselves facing claimants whose genetic credentials are demonstrably more authentic than their own. The timing of these genetic discoveries coinciding with the prophesied year of 2025 cannot be accidental. Someone has been orchestrating the release of evidence according to a predetermined schedule that maximizes its political impact while minimizing opportunities for suppression or discreditation. The biological archives were designed to remain hidden until genetic analysis technology became sophisticated enough to prove their significance, but also until political conditions became favorable for acting on the claims they support. Current European political instability creates exactly the kind of environment where revolutionary genealogical claims might find receptive audiences. Traditional monarchies are facing unprecedented challenges to their relevance and authority, while democratic institutions are struggling with legitimacy. Crises that make alternative forms of governance appear increasingly attractive. Popular dissatisfaction with existing leadership creates opportunities for new claimants who can offer compelling evidence of superior credentials and authentic authority. The Merovingian restoration conspiracy has been waiting 13 centuries for precisely this combination of technological capability and political vulnerability. Medieval prophets couldn't have predicted DNA sequencing or computer analysis, But they understood that cyclical patterns of political decay would eventually create opportunities for displaced dynasties to reclaim their inheritance. The mathematical precision of their calculations proves that someone was thinking in terms of generational planning that extends far beyond normal human time horizons. But the genetic evidence reveals something even more disturbing about the scope of the bloodline conspiracy. DNA analysis shows that Merovingian genetic markers appear in samples collected from noble families throughout Europe, not just in France and Belgium where the original dynasty ruled. The bloodline was preserved not through a single hidden lineage, but through a network of intermarriage and genetic distribution that placed Merovingian descendants in positions of influence across the entire continent. This widespread genetic distribution means that Merovingian restoration claims won't be limited to a single family or region asserting authority over specific territories. Instead, multiple bloodline carriers could simultaneously emerge from noble houses throughout Europe, each possessing genetic credentials that prove their connection to the original dynasty. The restoration wouldn't involve one family reclaiming an ancient throne, but rather a coordinated revelation by dozens of families who have been secretly maintaining their genetic inheritance while waiting for the prophesied moment of return. If you're still here, leave a like so we know you're following along, and stay with me as we continue this exploration of events. The implications for European political stability are enormous. If genetic analysis proves that Merovingian bloodlines have been preserved within existing noble families across multiple countries, then the restoration conspiracy isn't an external threat to current power structures. It's an internal revolution that has been incubating within the European aristocracy for over a millennium, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself and transform the entire continental political order from within. Current European noble families who have maintained unusual secrecy about their genealogical records may not be hiding embarrassing ancestors or questionable financial dealings. They may be concealing genetic test results that prove their connection to bloodlines that were supposedly extinct, waiting for coordination signals that will allow them to reveal their true ancestry simultaneously across multiple countries. The ancient obligations and hereditary responsibilities they reference in private conversations may be code words for participation in a restoration conspiracy that has been maintained across dozens of generations. The bee symbolism that appears throughout European heraldry takes on entirely new significance when understood as a recognition system used by hidden Merovingian descendants to identify each other across national boundaries and political divisions. Every noble house that incorporates bee imagery into their coat of arms may be signaling their participation in the bloodline conspiracy, creating a visual network of genetic alliance that has operated in plain sight for centuries while remaining invisible to outsiders who didn't understand its true meaning. Napoleon's adoption of bee symbolism wasn't random cultural borrowing or aesthetic preference. It was a declaration of genetic legitimacy that announced his connection to bloodlines that predated and superseded the Bourbon dynasty he was displacing. His rapid rise to power and ability to command loyalty across European boundaries becomes more understandable when viewed as the emergence of a Merovingian descendant who was supported by hidden networks of genetic relatives throughout the continental aristocracy. The European Union's 12-star flag represents more than symbolic unity or democratic ideals. It announces the completion of the circle of stars prophesied in medieval texts as the signal for Merovingian restoration. The flag wasn't designed by bureaucrats seeking neutral symbolism for a new international organization. It was chosen by people who understood its connection to ancient prophecies and wanted to signal that the time for bloodline revelation was approaching. Every aspect of modern European integration can be understood as preparation for dynastic restoration that will transcend national boundaries and democratic institutions. The elimination of border controls, the standardization of legal systems, and the centralization of political authority create exactly the kind of continental infrastructure that would be necessary for implementing claims to authority from bloodline rather that derive than popular consent. The European Union isn't just a political project designed to prevent future wars or enhance economic cooperation. It's the governmental framework that will allow Merovingian descendants to exercise authority over territories that correspond to their ancestral domains. The Brussels discovery of the prophecy parchment wasn't a random archaeological find or elaborate hoax designed to generate publicity. It was a carefully timed announcement that the restoration process is beginning and that evidence of Merovingian survival will soon emerge from archives that have been sealed for over a millennium. The parchment serves as both proof of the conspiracy's authenticity and a declaration of intent that warns current European leaders about the challenges to their authority that are about to unfold. The long-haired kings aren't just returning to claim symbolic recognition or historical vindication. They're preparing to assert political authority that will transform the entire structure of European governance according to principles that predate and supersede democratic ideology. Their legitimacy claims are based on genetic inheritance rather than popular consent, divine appointment rather than constitutional authority, and sacred bloodlines rather than electoral mandates. The question facing Europe in 2025 isn't whether the Merovingians survived or when they'll reveal themselves. The question is whether existing political institutions can survive the emergence of claimants whose credentials are older, more authentic, and more scientifically verifiable than any authority structure currently operating on the continent. The prophecy is unfolding exactly as medieval calculations predicted, and the evidence supporting bloodline claims is about to overwhelm every defense that democratic governments can mount against dynastic restoration. The year 2025 has brought more than just calendar anxiety to European capitals. Intelligence agencies across the continent are quietly monitoring a surge in genealogical research requests from noble families who haven't shown interest in their ancestry for centuries. Private laboratories specializing in ancient DNA analysis report unprecedented demand from clients willing to pay extraordinary sums for discretion and speed. Something is stirring in the bloodlines of Europe's oldest houses, and government officials are beginning to understand that the Brussels parchment discovery may have been less of a coincidence and more of a signal. French intelligence services have documented at least 17 separate requests for access to restricted genealogical archives in the past 6 months, all from families whose heraldic symbols incorporate bee motifs or star patterns that mirror the imagery found on the mysterious parchment. These aren't amateur genealogy enthusiasts exploring family history for personal satisfaction. These are established aristocratic houses employing teams of professional researchers, linguists, and genetic specialists to investigate bloodline claims that could reshape the political landscape of modern Europe. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine the geographical distribution of these research activities. The families making inquiries aren't randomly scattered across the continent. They're concentrated in regions that correspond exactly to former Merovingian territories, as if someone had drawn a map of 8th century Frankish domains and highlighted every location where genetic preservation efforts might have been successful. Southern France, eastern Belgium, the Rhine Valley, and isolated pockets in the Scottish Highlands are experiencing coordinated genealogical investigations that suggest careful planning rather than spontaneous curiosity. What makes these research efforts particularly significant is their timing. The families involved have maintained strict privacy about their ancestral records for generations, often refusing to participate in historical studies or allow researchers access to their private archives. Their sudden willingness to engage in extensive genealogical investigation coinciding with the 2025 prophecy timeline indicates that they're responding to signals or instructions that have been dormant for decades or possibly centuries. Belgian security services have intercepted communications between several of these noble houses that use coded language reminiscent of medieval correspondence found in Templar archives. References to awakening bloodlines and completing the circle appear frequently in encrypted messages passed between families who officially have no known connections to each other. The encryption methods themselves are based on numerical systems that trace back to medieval manuscripts, suggesting that these families have been maintaining communication protocols that were established centuries ago and activated only when specific conditions were met. The sophistication of this coordinated response reveals something crucial about the scope of the Bloodline conspiracy. These families aren't just discovering their potential Merovingian connections in 2025. They've known about their genetic heritage for generations and have been waiting for the prophesied moment when it would be safe to reveal their true ancestry. The research they're conducting isn't exploratory investigation to determine whether they might have royal blood. It's confirmation testing to document bloodline credentials they already know they possess. This advanced knowledge explains the mathematical precision of the 2025 prophecy. Medieval calculations weren't based on mystical speculation about cosmic cycles. They were based on practical planning by people who understood exactly when their descendants would be in positions to act on hereditary claims without facing the kind of systematic persecution that destroyed their ancestors. The prophecy wasn't a prediction. It was a schedule. German intelligence analysts have identified financial transfers between these noble families that follow patterns established in medieval banking records. The same coded accounting methods used by Italian merchant houses to support hidden Merovingian descendants are being employed by contemporary financial institutions to coordinate resources for the genealogical research campaign. Someone has maintained operational security protocols across 7 centuries, adapting medieval conspiracy techniques to modern technological capabilities. The amounts being spent on this research exceed what would be reasonable for historical curiosity or family pride. Several families have liquidated significant assets to fund genetic analysis projects that require access to specialized equipment and expert personnel typically reserved for major archaeological or forensic investigations. The financial commitment indicates that they expect returns on their investment that go far beyond personal satisfaction with confirmed ancestry. Insurance companies across Europe have reported unusual policy inquiries from these same families, specifically requesting coverage for hereditary claims disputes and dynastic succession proceedings that don't correspond to any known legal frameworks in contemporary European law. The insurance industry is struggling to understand what risks these families are trying to protect themselves against, but the policy language suggests they anticipate challenges to existing political authority that could result in significant financial and legal consequences. Vatican archives have experienced their first security breach in over 2 centuries, with intruders specifically targeting sections that contain medieval correspondence between popes and European noble houses. The thieves ignored valuable artifacts and rare manuscripts, focusing exclusively on documents that might contain information about bloodline preservation efforts coordinated between church authorities and aristocratic families. The precision of the theft indicates that the perpetrators knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. Church officials have remained silent about what was stolen, but leaked inventory reports suggest that the missing documents include papal communications about sacred obligations and ancient covenants that were supposed to remain sealed until specific chronological conditions were met. The timing of the theft, occurring just months after the Brussels parchment discovery, suggests that someone is accelerating their timeline and gathering evidence that was meant to remain hidden until later in the restoration process. Archaeological sites throughout former Merovingian territories have reported unusual nighttime activity by teams using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. These aren't random treasure hunters or amateur historians exploring local legends. These are professional archaeological teams with expensive equipment and expert personnel conducting systematic searches for specific artifacts or burial sites that correspond to locations mentioned in medieval records. Local authorities who have attempted to investigate these unauthorized excavations have discovered that the teams possess legitimate research permits issued by government agencies that claim no knowledge of authorizing such activities. The permit documentation is authentic, But the bureaucratic trail leads to offices that don't exist and officials who have no record of involvement in archaeological oversight. Someone has infiltrated European administrative systems deeply enough to generate official authorization for activities that governments aren't aware they've approved. The artifacts being recovered from these excavations aren't being deposited in museums or academic institutions. They're disappearing into private collections maintained by the same noble families conducting genealogical research. Physical evidence that could prove or disprove Merovingian bloodline claims is being gathered and controlled by the potential claimants themselves, ensuring that scientific analysis will be conducted according to their timelines and objectives rather than independent academic standards. DNA sequencing laboratories across Europe have received samples for analysis that contain genetic material far older than contemporary forensic specimens. Radiocarbon dating indicates that some samples are over 1,000 years old, preserved using techniques that shouldn't have been available to medieval science. The genetic signatures are unlike anything in existing European royal lineage databases, but they show consistent patterns across samples submitted by different families from different regions. Laboratory technicians report that the families submitting these samples seem more interested in confirming specific genetic markers than in general ancestry analysis. They arrive with detailed charts showing exactly what DNA sequences they expect to find, as if they already know what the results will reveal and are conducting testing to generate documentation rather than to discover unknown information. The genetic analysis isn't exploratory research. It's evidence gathering to support claims that have already been established through other means. Preliminary results from these DNA tests are being kept confidential, but leaked information suggests that the genetic markers found in ancient samples appear in contemporary family members from multiple European noble houses. The bloodline preservation efforts weren't limited to a single family maintaining their genetic integrity across 13 centuries. Multiple families were involved in a coordinated breeding program that distributed Merovingian genetic markers throughout European aristocracy, while maintaining detailed records of which families carried which genetic signatures. This widespread genetic distribution means that Merovingian restoration claims won't be limited to one family or one region. When the revelation occurs, it will involve coordinated announcements by dozens of families across multiple countries, all possessing genetic credentials that prove their connection to the original dynasty. The restoration won't be a single claimant challenging existing authority. It will be a continental network of genetically verified descendants simultaneously asserting their hereditary rights. European intelligence services are beginning to understand that they're not monitoring a historical curiosity or genealogical hobby. They're observing the final preparation phase of a political revolution that has been planned and coordinated across more than a millennium. The families involved aren't just researching their ancestry. They're documenting their credentials for claims to authority that will challenge every government currently operating on the European continent. The mathematical precision of the 2025 timeline wasn't based on mystical numerology or prophetic speculation. It was calculated by medieval strategists who understood exactly how long it would take for their descendants to reach positions of sufficient influence and resources to successfully challenge the power structures that destroyed their ancestors. They weren't predicting divine intervention. They were planning a political campaign that would unfold over 13 centuries. Current European leaders who have built their careers on democratic mandates and constitutional authority are about to discover that their legitimacy is based on historical narratives that were deliberately falsified to conceal evidence of more authentic claims to power. The governmental systems they represent aren't the natural evolution of political development. They're temporary arrangements that were established to maintain order while legitimate rulers remained in exile. The bee symbolism that appears throughout European political iconography isn't decorative borrowing from ancient traditions. It's a recognition system that has allowed hidden Merovingian descendants to identify and coordinate with each other across national boundaries and political divisions. Every government building, official seal, and ceremonial object that incorporates bee imagery may have been placed ASD there by people who understood its true significance, a marker of bloodline loyalty. Napoleon's adoption of B symbols wasn't aesthetic preference or cultural revival. It was a declaration of genetic legitimacy that announced his connection to bloodlines that predated the monarchies he was conquering. His rapid rise to power and ability to command loyalty across European territories becomes comprehensible when understood as the emergence of a Merovingian descendant, supported by hidden networks of genetic relatives throughout the continental aristocracy. The European Union itself may represent more than international cooperation or economic integration. The elimination of national boundaries, standardization of legal systems, and centralization of political authority create exactly the governmental framework that would be necessary for implementing continental claims to power based on bloodline rather than popular consent. The Union isn't just facilitating trade and preventing war. It's preparing the infrastructure for dynastic restoration. The 12-star flag wasn't chosen by bureaucrats seeking neutral symbolism for a new international organization. It was designed by people who understood its connection to medieval prophecies about completing the circle of stars as a signal for Merovingian return. The flag doesn't represent European unity or democratic ideals. It announces that the prophetic conditions for bloodline revelation have been fulfilled and that the restoration process can begin. Intelligence analysts across European capitals are realizing that their governments may be facing challenges to authority that their constitutional systems aren't equipped to handle. Democratic institutions are designed to manage transitions between elected leaders, not to respond to hereditary claims that predate and potentially supersede electoral legitimacy. Legal frameworks that govern political succession assume that authority derives from popular consent rather than genetic inheritance. The families preparing to assert Merovingian bloodline claims aren't planning to participate in existing democratic processes or seek recognition through constitutional procedures. They're preparing to challenge the fundamental assumptions about political authority that have governed European civilization since the medieval period. Their legitimacy claims are based on principles that transcend national boundaries, democratic institutions, and popular sovereignty. Vatican officials who have remained silent about the archive theft are beginning to understand that the stolen documents may contain evidence that could undermine not just political authority, but religious legitimacy as well. If the Merovingians possessed proof of bloodline connections to biblical figures, their restoration could challenge ecclesiastical authority structures that have governed Christian civilization for over a millennium. The scope of the conspiracy extends beyond political succession to encompass religious authority, economic systems, and social hierarchies that have structured European civilization since the medieval period. The returning Merovingians aren't just claiming political power. They're asserting authority over every institutional structure that participated in their original suppression. European military commanders are quietly reviewing security protocols for scenarios that don't appear in any standard threat assessment manuals. How do democratic governments respond to challenges claimants whose credentials may be more historically authentic than their own? How do constitutional systems handle succession disputes when the claimants reject the legitimacy of constitutional authority itself? The Brussels parchment discovery may have been more than an announcement of Merovingian return. It may have been a declaration of war against political systems that have governed Europe for over 12 centuries. The long-haired kings aren't just coming back. They're preparing to reclaim everything that was taken from them, and they possess evidence that could make their claims impossible to refute or ignore. The year 2025 isn't just witnessing the fulfillment of medieval prophecy. It's experiencing the culmination of the most patient and comprehensive political conspiracy in European history. The Merovingian Restoration isn't a historical curiosity or genealogical anomaly. It's a revolution that has been planned across more than 40 generations, and it's about to transform every assumption about political authority, religious legitimacy, and social hierarchy that has governed Western civilization since the fall of Rome. Intelligence services monitoring these developments are beginning to understand that they may be witnessing not just a change in government, but a fundamental transformation in the nature of political authority itself. The democratic experiment that has dominated European politics for the past few centuries may have been nothing more than an interregnum, a temporary arrangement that maintained order while the legitimate rulers prepared for their prophesied return. The mathematical calculations that predicted 2025 as the year of restoration weren't based on mystical speculation about cosmic cycles. They were based on practical assessment of how long it would take for bloodline descendants to accumulate sufficient resources, influence, and evidence to successfully challenge the systems that destroyed their ancestors. Medieval strategists understood that patience was their greatest weapon, and they were willing to wait 13 centuries for the perfect moment to strike. That moment has arrived. The genetic evidence is compiled. The financial resources are mobilized. The political conditions are favorable, and the hidden networks that preserved Merovingian bloodlines across 40 generations are finally ready to reveal themselves. European leaders who have built their authority on democratic mandates and constitutional frameworks are about to discover that their legitimacy is nothing compared to bloodlines that were chosen by forces far older and more permanent than popular opinion. The long-haired kings aren't just returning to reclaim symbolic recognition or historical vindication. They're preparing to assert political authority that will fundamentally reshape European governance according to principles that predate democratic ideology by over a millennium. Their legitimacy claims are based on genetic inheritance rather than electoral consent, divine appointment rather than constitutional authority, sacred bloodlines rather than popular mandates. The prophecy is unfolding exactly as medieval calculations predicted, and the evidence supporting bloodline claims is about to overwhelm every defense that democratic governments can mount against dynastic restoration. The question facing Europe in 2025 isn't whether the Merovingians survived or when they'll reveal themselves. The question is whether existing political institutions can survive the emergence of claimants whose credentials are older, more authentic, and more scientifically verifiable than any authority structure currently operating on the continent. The bee swarms are gathering, the circle of stars is complete, and the long-haired kings are preparing to reclaim their inheritance. 13 centuries of exile are about to end, and European civilization is about to discover what happens when legitimate rulers return to claim what was never rightfully taken from them. The Merovingian prophecy isn't just being fulfilled. It's about to transform everything we thought we knew about who really holds authority over the future of European civilization. The financial networks supporting this genealogical investigation campaign reveal coordination that extends far beyond what individual noble families could achieve independently. Swiss banking records show synchronized asset transfers between accounts held by families across multiple countries, all occurring within the same narrow time frame as the genealogical research activities. These aren't random coincidences or seasonal investment adjustments. The transfers follow patterns that mirror medieval banking practices used to support hidden Merovingian descendants, suggesting that financial protocols established centuries ago are being reactivated for contemporary use. Credit Suisse archives contain transaction records dating back to the 18th century that show regular payments to accounts identified only by heraldic symbols, matching those found on coats of arms belonging to families currently conducting bloodline research. The continuity of these financial arrangements across multiple generations indicates that someone has been maintaining operational funding for bloodline preservation activities for over 3 centuries, adjusting payment methods and banking institutions as financial systems evolved while preserving the essential structure of resource allocation. The amounts involved dwarf what would be reasonable for historical research or family genealogy projects. Several families have liquidated Renaissance artwork, medieval manuscripts, and ancient jewelry collections to fund genetic analysis programs that require access to specialized laboratory equipment typically reserved for major archaeological expeditions or criminal forensic investigations. The liquidation patterns suggest they're converting historical assets into liquid capital according to predetermined schedules rather than responding to unexpected financial needs. Insurance brokers throughout Europe report unprecedented demand for policies covering hereditary succession disputes and dynastic legitimacy challenges from the same families funding genealogical research. The policy language requests coverage for legal proceedings that don't correspond to any existing frameworks in contemporary European law, suggesting that the families anticipate challenges to political authority that will require entirely new categories of legal protection. Lloyd's of London underwriters are struggling to assess risks for scenarios they've never encountered in 3 centuries of insuring European nobility. Archaeological equipment rental companies have experienced unusual demand for ground-penetrating radar systems, excavation machinery, and preservation materials from clients who pay premium rates for discretion and off-hours access to sensitive locations. The equipment specifications match those required for systematic tomb excavation and artifact recovery rather than surface-level archaeological surveys, indicating that someone is conducting comprehensive searches for physical evidence rather than exploratory investigations. Vatican security services have discovered that the recent archive breach was more sophisticated than initially reported. The intruders possessed detailed knowledge of medieval filing systems and manuscript organization methods that wouldn't be available to casual researchers or opportunistic thieves. They navigated directly to specific collections containing papal correspondence about bloodline preservation agreements between church authorities and European noble houses, suggesting they had advance intelligence about what documents existed and where to find them. The stolen Vatican documents include papal bulls from the 9th through 13th centuries that reference sacred covenants and hereditary obligations between Rome and noble families, whose territories corresponded to former Merovingian domains. These weren't general diplomatic communications or routine ecclesiastical correspondence. They were specific agreements about maintaining bloodline documentation and providing protection for descendants whose existence needed to remain concealed from political authorities. Church officials who have reviewed inventory records of the missing documents report that the thieves ignored priceless illuminated manuscripts and rare theological texts, focusing exclusively on administrative correspondence that contained genealogical information and succession agreements. The selectivity indicates that the perpetrators weren't motivated by financial gain or academic curiosity, but were gathering specific evidence to support predetermined claims about hereditary legitimacy. Interpol databases show coordinated surveillance activities targeting government archives, monastery libraries, and private manuscript collections throughout former Merovingian territories. The surveillance teams use professional equipment and sophisticated monitoring techniques that suggest military or intelligence service training rather than amateur historical research. Local authorities who have attempted to investigate these activities discovered that the teams possess legitimate research credentials issued by European Union cultural preservation agencies that claim no knowledge of authorizing such extensive monitoring operations. The surveillance targets correspond precisely to locations mentioned in medieval texts about bloodline preservation and document concealment. Someone has compiled comprehensive lists of every archive, library, and private collection that might contain evidence relevant to Merovingian survival claims, then systematically monitored those locations to determine optimal times for evidence recovery. The coordination required for such extensive surveillance indicates organizational capabilities that rival government intelligence services. DNA sequencing laboratories across Europe report receiving ancient biological samples that contain genetic material preserved using techniques unknown to medieval science, but consistent with modern cryogenic storage methods. Carbon dating confirms that the samples are over 1,000 years old, yet the genetic integrity is sufficient for comprehensive analysis using contemporary sequencing technology. The preservation quality suggests that someone understood principles of long-term biological storage centuries before such techniques were developed by mainstream science. Laboratory technicians who have analyzed these samples report genetic signatures that don't match any known European royal lineages, but show consistent markers across specimens submitted by different families from different regions. The genetic patterns indicate common ancestry from a bloodline that remained genetically isolated from other European noble houses while maintaining its integrity through carefully controlled breeding programs. This level of genetic consistency across multiple family lines would require coordination and record-keeping that extends across dozens of generations. The families submitting these genetic samples arrive with detailed charts showing exactly what DNA sequences they expect to find, as if they already possess comprehensive genetic maps of their bloodlines and are conducting testing to generate official documentation rather than to discover unknown ancestry. The genetic analysis isn't exploratory research seeking to identify potential royal connections. It's confirmation testing designed to create scientific evidence supporting hereditary claims that have been maintained through oral traditions and private records for centuries. Preliminary DNA results leaked from several laboratories indicate that Merovingian genetic markers appear in contemporary members of noble families across multiple European countries. The bloodline preservation efforts weren't limited to a single family maintaining genetic purity in isolation. Multiple families participated in a coordinated breeding network that distributed specific genetic signatures throughout European aristocracy while maintaining detailed records of which houses carried which bloodline markers. This widespread genetic distribution means that Merovingian restoration claims will involve simultaneous revelations by dozens of families, rather than a single claimant challenging existing authority. When the genetic evidence is publicly revealed, it will demonstrate a continental network of bloodline preservation that operated across multiple kingdoms and survived every political transformation that occurred after 751. The restoration won't be one family reclaiming an ancient throne, but a coordinated emergence of genetically verified descendants asserting collective hereditary rights. European intelligence services monitoring these developments have discovered that the noble families involved in genealogical research maintain encrypted communication networks using codes based on medieval manuscript systems. The encryption methods incorporate numerical sequences found in Templar documents and papal correspondence, suggesting that communication protocols established centuries ago are being reactivated to coordinate contemporary activities. The sophistication of these communication systems indicates that the families have preserved not just bloodline records, but also operational security techniques developed by their ancestors. Government cryptographers who have attempted to decode these communications report that the encryption keys appear to be contained, based on information in documents that were supposedly destroyed during medieval purges of Merovingian records. The families are using knowledge that shouldn't exist according to official historical narratives, proving that their ancestors successfully concealed crucial information from the systematic suppression campaigns that eliminated most traces of Merovingian heritage from public archives. French intelligence services have identified financial transfers between contemporary noble houses and Swiss banking institutions that use the same coded accounting methods found in medieval Italian merchant records. The numerical systems employed for transaction identification match those used by banking houses that supported hidden Merovingian descendants during the 13th and 14th centuries. Someone has maintained operational continuity across 7 centuries, adapting medieval conspiracy techniques to contemporary financial systems while preserving essential organizational structures. The scope of financial resources being mobilized for the genealogical research campaign indicates coordination by an organization with assets that accumulated across multiple generations rather than resources available to individual families acting independently. The funding patterns suggest that wealth preservation strategies established during medieval times have been maintained and expanded through centuries of careful investment and resource management, creating financial capabilities that rival those of sovereign governments. British intelligence analysts have documented unusual activity at archaeological sites throughout Scotland where medieval records indicate Templar properties once existed. Professional excavation teams with expensive equipment are conducting systematic searches for artifacts and documents that might contain evidence of bloodline preservation activities. The excavations are being funded by the same noble families conducting genealogical research, indicating that they're seeking physical evidence to complement genetic and documentary proof of their hereditary claims. Local authorities who have attempted to investigate these archaeological activities discover that the excavation teams possess legitimate permits issued by government agencies that deny any knowledge of authorizing such extensive operations. The permit documentation is authentic and properly executed, but the bureaucratic trail leads to offices that don't exist and officials who have no record of involvement in archaeological oversight. Someone has infiltrated European administrative systems deeply enough to generate official authorization for activities that governments aren't aware they've approved. The artifacts being recovered from these excavations aren't being deposited in museums or academic institutions where they could be subjected to independent analysis. Instead, they're disappearing into private collections maintained by the families funding the excavations, ensuring that evidence relevant to bloodline claims will be controlled by the potential claimants themselves rather than neutral academic authorities. This systematic evidence gathering indicates that the families are preparing comprehensive documentation packages to support hereditary claims that will be difficult to challenge or refute. Medieval weapons and ceremonial objects recovered from these excavations show craftsmanship techniques and material compositions that don't match known examples from the 8th century. The metallurgy and artistic methods are more sophisticated than contemporary archaeological evidence suggests was available to medieval craftsmen, indicating that Merovingian artisans possessed technical knowledge that was lost when their dynasty was suppressed. The artifacts provide physical evidence that the historical record of Merovingian capabilities was deliberately falsified to make them appear less technologically advanced than they actually were. Religious artifacts discovered during these excavations include ceremonial objects incorporating both Christian and pre-Christian symbolism in combinations that don't appear in any known medieval religious traditions. The iconography suggests that Merovingian religious practices incorporated elements that were suppressed by church authorities who rewrote the dynasty's history to make them appear as conventional Christian rulers. These artifacts provide evidence that the Merovingians maintained spiritual traditions that were considered dangerous enough to require systematic elimination from the historical record. Manuscript fragments recovered from sealed containers buried at excavation sites contain text in languages that medieval scholars claim were never used for official Merovingian documentation. The linguistic analysis indicates that the dynasty maintained administrative records in scripts that were deliberately concealed from contemporary chroniclers, suggesting that they possessed knowledge systems that they kept hidden even from their own subjects. These linguistic discoveries prove that official historical accounts of Merovingian capabilities were based on incomplete information that missed crucial aspects of their actual administrative and cultural sophistication. Carbon dating of organic materials found at excavation sites confirms that burial and concealment activities occurred during multiple time periods spanning from the 8th century through the 18th century. The evidence indicates that documents and artifacts were being systematically hidden and relocated across more than a millennium, proving that bloodline preservation efforts continued long after the official end of the dynasty. Someone was maintaining active programs for evidence concealment and protection across dozens of generations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at former Merovingian sites reveal underground chambers and concealed storage areas that don't appear on any historical architectural plans. These hidden spaces show evidence of recent access and modification, indicating that they've been maintained and used throughout the centuries since their original construction. The chambers contain preservation equipment and storage systems that incorporate both medieval construction techniques and modern environmental controls, proving that ancient concealment systems have been continuously upgraded to protect their contents using contemporary technology. Seismic analysis of these underground facilities reveals that they're connected by tunnel networks that extend across multiple properties and link sites that are separated by dozens of kilometers. The tunnel systems show evidence of recent maintenance and expansion, indicating that they're being actively used for transportation and communication purposes rather than serving as historical artifacts. Someone has maintained and modernized infrastructure that was originally constructed over a millennium ago, creating a hidden network that operates parallel to contemporary transportation and communication systems. Electronic surveillance equipment discovered in these tunnel networks incorporates both medieval architectural concealment techniques and cutting-edge monitoring technology. The systems are designed to detect and track anyone who approaches the hidden facilities, while remaining completely invisible to standard security sweeps. The sophistication of these surveillance networks indicates that the people maintaining them possess technical capabilities that rival those of government intelligence services while operating with security protocols that have been refined across centuries of clandestine activity. Computer analysis of data recovered from these surveillance systems reveals monitoring logs that track the movements and activities of European government officials, intelligence operatives, and academic researchers who have shown interest in Merovingian history. The surveillance extends beyond protecting hidden facilities to include comprehensive intelligence gathering about anyone who might pose threats to bloodline preservation activities. This level of operational security indicates that the conspiracy maintains active counterintelligence capabilities designed to neutralize potential threats before they can interfere with restoration plans. The scope and sophistication of these hidden networks prove that Merovingian bloodline preservation involved far more than maintaining genealogical records and genetic samples. The conspiracy established comprehensive infrastructure for intelligence gathering, secure communication, resource management, and operational coordination that has been maintained and expanded across 13 centuries. The people preparing for restoration in 2025 aren't just claiming hereditary legitimacy based on ancient bloodlines. They're backed by organizational capabilities that have been developed and refined across more than 40 generations of clandestine activity. European military intelligence services reviewing this evidence are beginning to understand that they may be facing challenges from an organization whose operational capabilities exceed those of most sovereign governments. The hidden networks supporting Merovingian restoration claims possess infrastructure, resources, and expertise that have been accumulating for over a millennium while remaining completely invisible to official monitoring systems. Democratic governments that derive their authority from popular consent and constitutional frameworks may be confronting claimants whose institutional capabilities are older, more sophisticated, and more comprehensive than their own. The mathematical precision of medieval prophecies predicting 2025 as the year of restoration wasn't based on mystical speculation about cosmic cycles. It was calculated by strategists who understood exactly how long it would take to develop the organizational infrastructure necessary to successfully challenge the systems that destroyed their ancestors. The prophecy wasn't divine revelation about supernatural intervention. It was a project timeline for the most comprehensive political conspiracy in European history. Intelligence analysts monitoring these developments are realizing that their governments may be facing succession challenges that their constitutional systems aren't equipped to handle. Democratic institutions are designed to manage transitions between elected leaders who accept the legitimacy of electoral processes. They have no frameworks for responding to hereditary claimants who possess genetic credentials, documentary evidence, financial resources, and organizational infrastructure that predate and potentially supersede democratic authority. The families preparing to assert Merovingian bloodline claims aren't planning to participate in existing electoral processes or seek recognition through constitutional procedures. They're preparing to challenge fundamental assumptions about political legitimacy that have governed European civilization since the medieval period. Their restoration claims are based on principles that transcend national boundaries, democratic institutions, and popular sovereignty, backed by organizational capabilities that have been developed across more than a millennium of clandestine preparation. Vatican officials who initially downplayed the significance of the archive theft are beginning to understand that the stolen documents may contain evidence that could undermine religious as well as political authority. If the Merovingians possessed proof of bloodline connections to biblical figures, their restoration could challenge ecclesiastical power structures that have governed Christian civilization for over 1,000 years. The scope of the threat extends beyond governmental succession to encompass the fundamental bases of institutional authority throughout European society. European military commanders are quietly reviewing security protocols for scenarios that don't appear in any standard threat assessment manuals. How do democratic governments respond to challenges from claimants whose credentials may be more historically authentic than their own? How do constitutional systems handle succession disputes when the claimants reject the legitimacy of constitutional authority itself and possess organizational infrastructure that rivals or exceeds government capabilities? The Brussels parchment discovery is beginning to appear less like a historical curiosity and more like a declaration of intent by an organization that has been preparing for this moment across 13 centuries. The document wasn't just announcing the return of Merovingian bloodlines. It was serving notice that the most patient and comprehensive political conspiracy in European history is finally ready to implement plans that have been developing across more than 40 generations. Intelligence services across European capitals are beginning to understand that the genealogical research activities they've been monitoring may represent the final preparation phase of a political revolution that will challenge every assumption about governmental authority, religious legitimacy, and social hierarchy that has structured European civilization since the fall of Rome. The Merovingian Restoration conspiracy isn't just claiming symbolic recognition or historical vindication. It's preparing to assert political authority that will fundamentally transform the nature of European governance according to principles that predate democratic ideology by over a millennium. The year 2025 isn't just witnessing the fulfillment of medieval prophecy. It's experiencing the culmination of organizational preparation that has been maintained and expanded across more generations than any government or institution currently operating in Europe. The long-haired kings aren't just returning to reclaim ancient titles or symbolic authority. They're backed by infrastructure, resources, and expertise that have been accumulating for over 1,000 years while remaining completely invisible to the political systems they're preparing to challenge. The question facing European leaders in 2025 isn't whether Merovingian bloodlines survived or when they'll reveal themselves. The question is whether existing governmental and institutional structures can survive the emergence of claimants whose organizational capabilities, historical credentials, and resource base may be more comprehensive and authentic than any authority structure currently operating on the continent. The prophecy is unfolding exactly as medieval calculations predicted, and the evidence supporting restoration claims is being backed by organizational infrastructure that democratic governments may be completely unprepared to confront or counter. The evidence extends beyond the underground networks to encompass something even more disturbing. Recent analysis of European parliamentary records reveals voting patterns that don't align with publicly stated national interests or party affiliations. Instead, they follow demographic patterns that correspond precisely to regions where Merovingian bloodline research has been most intensive. Representatives from districts in southern France, eastern Belgium, the Rhine Valley, and scattered constituencies across Scotland have been coordinating their votes according to agendas that transcend their official political allegiances. These parliamentary coordination patterns emerge most clearly on legislation involving historical preservation funding, archaeological protection laws, and genealogical research regulations. Bills that would restrict access to ancient burial sites or limit genetic testing of historical artifacts face systematic opposition from representatives whose constituencies include the noble families conducting bloodline research. The voting coordination suggests that these political figures aren't just responding to constituent pressure. They're implementing legislative strategies designed to protect and advance restoration activities. Committee hearings on European Union heritage policies have witnessed unprecedented attendance by observers who identify themselves as representatives of traditional European cultural organizations. These observers don't participate in public discussions, but they take detailed notes and submit formal written comments that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of legal frameworks governing archaeological research and genealogical documentation. The organizations they represent don't appear in standard databases of European cultural institutions, suggesting they operate through networks that remain hidden from conventional oversight. Parliamentary staff members report receiving briefing documents about heritage legislation from sources that possess detailed knowledge of medieval legal precedents and genealogical law that wouldn't be available to standard lobbying organizations. The briefing materials reference legal principles and historical precedents that predate contemporary constitutional frameworks, indicating that someone has maintained comprehensive understanding of governmental systems that were supposedly replaced centuries ago. These aren't academic exercises or historical curiosities. They're practical guides for navigating contemporary political processes using legal knowledge that spans multiple governmental transitions. So here we stand in 2025, watching parliamentary votes align in patterns that mirror medieval bloodline maps, witnessing genetic laboratories process samples preserved by techniques that shouldn't have existed centuries ago, and observing noble families liquidate priceless artifacts to fund research they've been planning for generations. The Brussels parchment wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was a starting pistol for the most patient conspiracy in human history. 13 centuries of hidden preparation, financial networks spanning continents, and organizational capabilities that rival sovereign governments are finally converging on this prophesied moment. If these stories stir your curiosity, leave a like and let me know what you think. Will the Merovingian prophecy finally come to fruition? Whether the long-haired kings actually return to claim their inheritance, or whether this represents the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on European civilization, one thing is certain. The events unfolding across the continent suggest that everything we thought we knew about who really holds power in Europe may be about to change forever. Until next time, sweet dreams and keep questioning. Oh, and you might want to watch the next video showing on your screen.